Hi, my name's Courtney Micheletti. This is my final presentation for Chicano Latino Studies. I titled my presentation More White or More Brown because it's been an interesting question that I feel I have faced most of my life. So this is home. Pardon the mispronunciation, but where I grew up, it's pronounced as Del Norte County. Um, we are in the upper left corner of California, right on the California-Oregon border. It's very rural. There are no towns or cities for about 30 miles, and then again, not for another about 150 miles. Very sparsely populated. Here are some statistics based on a census report of Del Norte County from 2014. So as far as the race demographic goes, the groups with the fastest growing populations are Hispanics, Latinos, specifically Mexicans, Asians, who are comprised of Hmongs, and some Vietnamese, and American Indians from the Yurok and Tolowa tribes. And those are the fastest growing populations for Del Norte County specifically. But Black African Americans are the fastest growing population in California at large. However, the county that I grew up in is still predominantly Caucasian. This Caucasian population is kind of the result of a lot of mining that came into the area, a lot of logging that came into the area early in its establishment, and resulted in the pronunciation of Del Norte rather than Del Norte. The age of this community is 40 to 54 years of old is the biggest group. Second largest group is 25 to 39, and that fits with about a 1-to-1 ratio of children that are in the community between 5 and 17. So a lot of retired folks and a lot of younger families, a lot of families that have been there for many generations. The largest in-migration groups are coming from Humboldt County, which is just to the south. We get a lot of people that are coming in from Humboldt County as the land is taken up for the marijuana growing industry. So they move north in search of new areas to grow. Curry County is the next county over the state line in Oregon, and sister city is there called Brookings. So there's a lot of fluid migration between the two of these towns. And then a lot of people coming up from Los Angeles County that the census didn't give an explanation to the occupation or the racial and age demographic of people coming in from Los Angeles specifically, but there is a lot of seasonal occupational opportunities and agriculture in Del Norte County. So I would only imagine that a large amount of these people that are being counted are coming up to do that agricultural work. Del Norte County is home to the largest Easter lily growing industry in the world, and that's very seasonal. Land usage, focusing on agricultural usage of land. 22.4% of the land in the county is privately owned, and out of that, 3.6% was harvested in 2011. Therefore, 1 out of 6 of all privately owned parcels is actively harvested for a total of 23,062 acres that's harvested each year. So a lot of agriculture going on. The economic status is something that is very divided in this community. Um, Looking at this chart, you can see that that pink line that runs along is California's poverty level on average, and the blue line above it is paralleling the poverty line but at a much higher level in Del Norte County specifically. A high poverty rate in an area can indicate economic and social issues among persons living in the community, and it may also indicate a scarcity of available employment or a dearth of skilled labor capable of earning higher wages. Overall, the people in this county have been suffering at an exceptionally high level of economic depression for a very long time. So this is me. The question, what are you? This is a question that I really am asked nearly every day. I don't think that people ask with the intention of being outright offensive, but it feels very intrusive when they're asking about my racial background without being prompted because of anything that we've discussed. It doesn't just come up in conversation when they ask me. I'm usually approached, and right away someone asks, "What are you?" People tag me with the word exotic just because I don't fit in with the profile of how they think someone who checks the Asian box on a census would look. I'm Filipina mestiza, I'm Asian, I'm white, but I don't really feel like I look like either. So here's some photos of my family. Familia, Italian side, and Familia, which is my Filipino side. This is my closest family. This center photo is of my mother, my father, my brothers and I. My brothers and I share father, so all the males in my family are white, and then my mother and I are Filipino. On the left-hand side here, just a couple of photos of my dad and I. And then on the right-hand side, pictures of my mother and I. You can see that we look very similar and always have. But I kind of put those pictures there of my dad and I to contrast because, I've actually been approached before and asked if I was okay because someone had thought that my dad had this little brown baby and that he wasn't actually my father. So, had a couple weird moments just because my dad and I look very dissimilar. So this is the Italian side of my family. Picture up in the upper right-hand corner is of my grandfather and his brothers enlisting in World War II. Top left-hand corner, my same grandfather later on in the war. This is my Filipino family. Feel like the family that I most look like, but don't actually identify with their culture quite as much. I saw them a lot when I was really young, but they lived really far away. They lived in Southern California, and as we saw, I lived in the very top portion, so I didn't really actually see them all that often. Maybe once, twice a year. I was really close with my grandparents. I spent all 3 months of every summer vacation with them typically, so my grandparents and I really had strong relationship, but again, not so much with the whole large Filipino family, but they're very boisterous, they're very celebratory, just very joyous people. This gentleman saluting the camera right here is my grandfather. His name is Teodoro Blanco Abad. He was in World War II and served in Guam. And after the war, he moved his family to Vallejo much later, in 1976. My mother was one of 6 children. And while living in Vallejo, my grandfather served at Mare Island, which was the first naval base on the West Coast, from 1976 until 1996 when it was decommissioned and closed. So, about the question, what's been your experience being from the place that you were born? It's pretty hard to reconcile the emotions I feel about growing up in rural Northern California. The geography of the region has always had my heart, but it's been challenging to remember the people with the same endearing affection. Living in Portland, the destination of such a large influx of out of state population, it feels like someone asks where you're from nearly every week. When I tell them that I'm from the Redwood National Forest in Northern California and they subsequently swoon over the physical beauty, it's hard not to shrug my shoulders a little bit in response. Sure, the ocean and the trees are obviously beautiful, but I hear very little commentary about the people there, unless they're non white. Racial diversity is sparse, and while significant portions of the population are represented by Latinos, Yurok, Tolowa, and Hmongs, the population is predominantly Caucasian. As someone who identifies as a mixed race person between an underrepresented racial demographic and white, I certainly experienced a duality in attitudes concerning the color of my skin while I was growing up there. Just to note also about the Hmong population, the Hmong are a minority group from Laos who fled their homeland during the Vietnam War and arrived as refugees. And most Hmong refugees actually settled in very pastoral areas of California and Minnesota. Have I been a part of the dominant group? I feel like I've certainly been a part of the dominant group most of my life. My father was one of less than 10 doctors in the county, all of them white. There was a massive group between the socioeconomic levels in the community, and the sad truth was that I didn't know anyone else in our community that was non white whose family wasn't in constant financial hardship. The poverty present in the county is crippling and touches everyone except a slim number of professionals and ranch owners. The socioeconomic division kept the county's residents equally segregated. I had a lot of friends, native, Mexican, white, Hmong, growing up, but I incurred a lot of criticism for the family that I was born into. White kids would assume that I was Mexican or native and interrogate me as to why I wasn't poor. Mexican and native kids resented me because I was brown, but not part of a family that shared the commonality of a cultural plight. Hmong kids used to tease me because when someone asked, "What are you?" and I replied, "Asian," I wasn't Asian enough. I grew up only ever meeting two other mixed race kids. One guy was half Filipino, half white, and the other guy was half black and half white, but definitely never identified himself as any other race than black. It felt a little weird to me to not be able to state a cultural identity that I felt held true for my mixed race as confidently as my friend who was half white and half black. So, do I carry multiple identities? I definitely carry multiple identities for the same reason of, having one foot in one culture and one foot in another, and never really having them present at the same time in my surrounding besides what was internalized. So, with my white identity, this created a lot of confusion within myself. I'm not entirely white nor Asian. I'm certainly not Mexican. I'm not native, and I'm not black. Honestly, I grew up identifying as a white female most of the time, and this perplexes me now. When I'm not surrounded by my Filipino family on the rare occasion, I feel most assimilated to white culture, and I'm still trying to figure out what that means. Most all of my friends are white, my partner's white, my closest family members are white, and I forget that we differ in the color of our skins until it's commented on. When I'm with my father and my brothers, people often assume that I'm a friend of the family, not family. When I spend the day taking care of my nephews or picking them up from school, I'm asked if I'm their nanny, not their aunt. I'm reminded that I'm not visually accepted as being white from most people. With my brown identity, you know, I experience a similarly jolting experience when I hang out with my friends of color. I sometimes feel like an imposter when someone makes a comment seeking camaraderie as to how our experiences growing up as women of color has been marginalized in compare to how white females grow up. My Cambodian friend came to the US as a refugee when she was a child, and she's often very verbally critical of traits that she observes that she associates with whiteness. And I'm sometimes felt ostracized by this criticism, to which she questions why. You're not white. I have to explain to her that I was never really brought into the fold of brown culture, besides when I saw my Filipino family, that I actually haven't spent time around very much in the last 10 years. So I've always kind of questioned, whether I felt more in line with my brown or my white identity. I used to spend a lot of time exploring and later working on a dairy farm that was owned by the family of a childhood friend. All of the men, besides the ranch owners who ran the dairy, were Mexican, and I ended up spending a lot of time with them and their families over the years. Like when I'd get invited home for lunch, where I learned to make tortillas and play with their kids. Although we worked together and became friends, I was still, I felt like an outsider. I wasn't Mexican, and despite my efforts, my Spanish never became fluent enough to not be a hindrance to the efficiency of the job. I can remember seeing the frustration sometimes with when a guy that I worked with, Angel, had to explain something to me in English because my Spanish wasn't proficient enough to understand certain concepts. Kind of held the process up when I was responsible for being able to communicate with all of these guys that just spoke in Spanish together. I had a different identity around these guys and with their families, or at least I viewed myself as more brown than white under these circumstances. Have I moved away from my place of birth? I certainly have. I feel lucky to have found myself in Portland. I moved away from where I grew up at an early age. I chose to leave high school in 3 years in order to leave. This was really uncommon for people in my area, so I felt like it was a pretty sad place and was ready to get out of there. The community was devastatingly underserved when it came to state and federal assistance programs, little to no educational opportunities, and the racial and ethnic diversity present was severely divided based on socioeconomic disparities. Moving to Portland in 2010 really expanded my vision to understanding just how oppressive the atmosphere and social structure of my hometown was. I'm embarrassed to admit that I stared at people a lot when I was new to the city because I had never experienced so many people of different colors in the same place with such diverse backgrounds. I'd see people of color that were dressed as professionals, and I felt like I never saw that because the socioeconomic divide between the classes where I grew up really kind of paralleled the racial diversity or lack thereof also. And sadly, as I've traveled and have been exposed to still greater racial and cultural diversity, the wonder that hit me with Portland's diversity, or what I thought it was at the time, really began to dwindle. I don't feel like I depend on employing multiple identities to avoid feeling like an outsider anymore. Since meeting so many other people who are mixed race in Portland, I feel a lot more comfortable talking about my cultural identity. Just because I didn't grow up surrounded by my Filipino family doesn't mean I can't express the nostalgia of cooking and eating my favorite Filipino dishes with any less validity. And just because I grew up in the middle of nowhere listening to old country songs doesn't mean that I'm a hick and that I get to love Ethiopian jazz and salsa dancing any less. So I guess to conclude, um, being around a greater diversity of people outside of what I was exposed to growing up and talking with other mixed race people that have a very similar experience with never really feeling like they are able to certainly declare a certain culture that they belong to has really helped me kind of come to a better understanding about my own cultural diversity.